of you here actually work for a portal company? Show of hands. There's 2 of you in the room. You've misnamed this whole thing. I'm very happy to be here. I want to thank Simon and Peter. When I kept thinking of those names, Simon and Peter invited me. I thought this was a very biblical group, so I was going to come up and do a religious presentation, but decided against it. We're going to talk a little bit about data. We're going to talk about why the data world is maybe a little bit bigger than what you typically think about when you think about real estate data. Most people I talk to when they think real estate data in the United States think MLS listings, what it is that the realtors are putting together. We're going to talk to you about how big the data universe has gotten over the last couple of decades. We're going to talk about how consumers are already using data to make their buying and selling decisions. We're going to talk about how data might actually make it harder for real estate transactions to happen because of some of the entities that are using real estate data now to manage risk. We're going to talk about how most of the real estate sites that I'm familiar with, most of the real estate companies that I'm familiar with, believe they're actually moving very rapidly into machine learning and artificial intelligence, and why, in fact, we're really at the very infancy of that movement. And we'll talk a little bit about where we might go in the future. My company, not my company, the company I work for, Adam Data Solutions, is one of the leading providers of real estate data to real estate, mortgage, financial services companies, insurance companies, and the like. And I wanted to show you this not as a sales pitch, but to give you an idea of how we categorize the data market for real estate. When I said it was much bigger than most people think about, we have 10 macro categories, if you will, of different types of real estate data, and then 87 distinct data types. And if you look at the macros, they range from things like property information, which we'll talk about, the property characteristics of a home, the lot size, so forth and so on. We'll talk about the ownership data that goes along with those properties. And keep in mind, just in the United States, there's about 110 million single-family properties that comprise this data. That's not counting the commercial properties. That's not counting some of the other land and different types of assets. Real estate data also includes a variety of different elements of the mortgage transaction. So there's always a loan attached to these properties. And in today's market, we also have things like valuations that we talk about. Today it was announced by Freddie Mac that we had a new record for homeowner equity in the country, $27 trillion of homeowner equity. 70% of the value of homes is comprised of equity today. Listing data, which is what most people are familiar with, things that are on the MLS. Foreclosure data, which is what Simon was talking about when we first met. I was working for a company called RealtyTrack that published the country's largest database of foreclosure information. And then categories that are a little bit new, relatively speaking, to these other ones. School data, which you're all familiar with, rankings and boundaries and the like. Neighborhood data, which gets into things like demographics, income flow. And then climate change risks, which is becoming a more important factor. And if you looked outside today in between sessions and you saw Miami about to become flooded yet again, that becomes something to think about. I just saw a headline about how properties in wildfire zones are actually selling at higher prices right now than they were a year ago. Will that continue indefinitely in a marketplace that is just ripe with wildfires and hurricanes and floods and other natural disasters as climate change has its effect? And then hazard issues, and that can be anything from crime to meth labs that happen to be in the area. All this data, all this underlying data is captured and categorized and put together. And as much data as we have up here, we don't have everything. There are 2 pieces here that I know are very, very important to consumers today that we don't even include. One is walkability scores. So if you're looking for a house in an area that has high walkability, you have to buy that somewhere else. Another is repair costs. So if you're an investor looking to buy a property, if you're a landlord who owns multiple properties, what's the cost of repairing a roof or redoing a kitchen in your marketplace? So there's just copious amounts of real estate data out there, and it's used in more and more different industries in more and more different ways. The obvious one, of course, is real estate. And that goes particularly in the consumer portal world. That's a pretty obvious play, but it goes beyond that. Goes into things like building and development decision making. I was talking to somebody a little earlier today about McDonald's, and McDonald's has always had a fully staffed real estate department that does copious research and finds just exactly the right location for that next McDonald's restaurant to be popped up. Burger King has a slightly different strategy. For years, what they've done is waited for McDonald's to break ground and then bought a lot across the street. And probably a lot more cost-effective way of doing it, but always reactive. The insurance industry is using more and more real estate data. The mortgage industry clearly is using more and more real estate data. Financial institutions and corporations, home services providers, marketing organizations, not included in here, educational institutions, government agencies. So everybody's getting into the act and using all of this real estate data in different ways. There are some degrees of difficulty involved in using real estate data. I showed you those 87 different data elements in the 10 macro categories that we have. Most of them come from discrete individual data sources. They're all captured differently, they're all recorded differently, they're all transmitted differently. So a big part of data providers' job is to take all that data, normalize it, and provide it in a way that's somewhat usable for clients. And we're seeing a variety of different distribution methodologies for data today, ranging from the old school way, which is I give you a flat file in an HTML site, and you figure out what to do with it tomorrow, to APIs, and most recently, cloud-based delivery mechanisms, which let you always have the freshest data, always the most up-to-date data. You never have to worry about that flat file being out of date, and instant access without you having to host everything. This is a hopelessly oversimplified schematic of what the data ecosystem looks like, but for most data companies, and for most companies that use data, that first bullet, that first circle on the top, data capture, is where 90% of the activity has been for the last 100 years. It's finding and collecting that data. It's capturing that data. The next step is to normalize and integrate that data to make it cross-referenceable, to make it usable for the end user. The third step is then to customize the way the data are delivered so that it's, again, easy for the customer to use and work with. And where we're going now, and this is where the industry thinks it's a little bit further along than it actually is, are the last two parts of this. One is data analysis. What am I doing with that data that I'm collecting? And I have to tell you, despite what our previous speaker was talking about, I tend to think most portal companies are in the same boat, in that they really do use data pretty much the same way as everybody else does. We'll talk about that more in a second. And then there's applied data and the need identification for new types of data, which become part of the feedback loop going back to the data providers, who now know they have to go out and find things like those two elements I just talked about, like walkability scores and like repair costs. If I'd been doing this presentation 3 or 4 years ago, that table of elements would have been less than half as big. And if I'd been doing it a year ago, wouldn't have had the climate risk components in it. So constantly adding different elements as a data provider. The current model that most real estate websites use is pretty consistent. It's basically an old-fashioned publishing model. And I don't mean old-fashioned in a bad way. I still actually read some magazines because, as I mentioned earlier, Simon and I are both old. But basically, publishers aggregate these listings. If there's missing information, and there's a lot of missing information in a listing, they license that from third-party sources. A home buyer then visits and searches. That leads to a lead being captured, an agent gets inserted into the process, a loan application gets filed, and if you're really lucky at the end of that process, you get to bid on a house and maybe buy the property. And this is the way it's been since the internet came along. It used to be the same way, except it was in a big, thick book that realtors walked around with called the MLS listing book. The traditional publisher model has something going for it and something going against it. What it has going for it is there's just a ton of useful information on everybody's portal. I have Zillow up here. My next slide, I have Realtor.com. I could just as easily have Redfin or Homes or half a dozen other US-based portals that I'm familiar with, but there is just way more information than the average consumer will ever need. What they have going against them is you're making the consumer, the user, do all the work. So basically what you're providing is, God bless you, is listings of properties up here, and asking the consumer to figure out which of these listings makes the most sense. And they do that to varying degrees of success. I think the NAR yesterday announced that 67% of all transactions last year involved somebody finding their property online, which is the highest percentage that's ever been. Still 88% of buyers work with a realtor, but that 67% is almost double what it was a few years ago. So more and more of that's going on. What's really interesting about these portal data displays is that the majority of data doesn't come from the MLS listings. And I pulled up this on Realtor.com because I really like this page. It shows you just how confusing and complicated things can be for a consumer. So valuation data. I talked about that earlier, automated valuation models, AVMs. That's a big part of what you see. And you know that if you get it wrong, you can have problems. Zillow got some of that wrong with their Zillow Offers program, and it cost them, they were only off by about $300 million in a quarter. So you have to be really careful with these automated valuation models. But look at the current listing price of this property on Realtor.com and the estimated value in June from 3 different AVM providers, $492,000, $326,000, and $286,000. If you're a consumer, what on earth do you do with that? You go offer 286, I guess, is what you do. But the point is, there's a lot of data. There's a lot of data that you can find. It may not be easy to find. It may not be easy to understand. It may not be easy to use. But if you want to go and buy a property based on local school ratings, you can do that. If you're concerned about environmental risk, you can find those factors. If you want to see what amenities happen to be near the property where you're buying, you can do that. So there's just, again, a ton of very useful information available. You have to be a detective to be able to find all of it. As I was getting ready for this, and Simon and his team were getting kind of frustrated with me because the presentation was due last week, and I think I gave it to them an hour ago, I found a story on Business Insider yesterday that I thought was a perfect example of what Amazon could teach the real estate industry. And it answers the question, when will the industry create customer-centric, data-driven real estate transactions? This writer talked about how she went to an Amazon store where algorithms picked her outfits. And now she and her 19-year-old sister never want to buy clothes the same way again. A brick-and-mortar store in Los Angeles, you do pretty much everything from your iPhones. Algorithm feeds outfit choices to the dressing room. And the way it works is you scan a QR code, you answer 3 or 4 questions, and then it starts to follow you around and picks out stuff for you so that when you get to the dressing room, not only are the items you asked for there, but a few other suggestions are. And then based on how you respond to the suggestions or what you're picking out yourself, it continues to feed you new things that you might want to actually buy. In the old days, this was called shopping at Nordstrom's. And you had Sally, who was your personal representative for the day, who kept saying things like, I know you came in for a belt, but this suit would look really good with it. And you'd buy it, and you'd leave with a comma in your receipt because Sally told you look good. But this is the future of real estate sites. This is the consumer first. Let the consumer lead you on the path, and you feed up the information in a consistently learning manner. What is the consumer telling you about what he or she is looking for, and what do you have in the store that you can feed to that consumer that meets that need? So it works more like this. The buyer visits a website, answers a few basic questions. The website rearranges itself, learns the buyer's taste, and starts to adjust what it displays to the consumer. At that point, we know what kind of house you're looking for. We have an idea of your price range. That tells us probably which lender might be the best of our partners to take you to. So we feed you the right lender. The agent's role becomes really much more focused on negotiations and closing. And you move forward with the bid at that point. To me, this is a much more intuitive, much more intelligent model that data can help drive. Are mortgage companies going to change this? There was some discussion about mortgage companies earlier as partners, and I think you have to start looking at them as competitors. I have these 4 companies up here, not for any particular reason other than that I've spoken with executives at all 4. 2 of them are very similar in Rocket and Loan Depot. Motto Mortgage is the franchise operation that RE/MAX introduced a few years ago. A New American Funding is a small independent non-bank lender who actually has a real high focus on Hispanic and other underserved borrowers. But they all have something in common. They all told me that in their call centers and online, between 65 and 75% of the people that apply for a loan are doing that before they've spoken with a real estate agent. Think about the implications there. For 150 years, the real estate agent is the person who took that buyer and introduced them to a lender. And now all of a sudden, 75% of the traffic is coming into the lender, getting financing in order before they've ever met with a realtor. To me, the implications here are just mind-boggling. And if you look at Rocket Mortgage and you look at their advertising today, they're advertising not just Rocket Mortgage, but Rocket Mortgage and Rocket Homes. So while you're there, while you're getting qualified, while you're getting your pre-approval letter to go out and shop for a home, they're going to start showing you those homes. And they're going to connect you with one of the agents in their network, who's certainly not going to take the loan away from Rocket, which is a good thing for the mortgage company, and who's certainly also going to bring them more business to keep that loyalty moving forward. But I would submit to you that if these mortgage companies know what they're doing, if they have good marketing chops, these are the companies that are best positioned to be the real estate leading companies in the future, which is not necessarily good news for the established real estate brands, potentially not even really good news for portals, unless they start doing a better job with the ancillary revenue streams that our previous talker spoke about. But in this model, the buyer secures financing first, the buyer is assigned to an agent in the network, the buyer searches for a property, the agent assists in the property search, and you go from there. Much straighter, much more straightforward, much more streamlined process. Let's take it to another step. I was working for a company that owns this brand called Villa Homes, and they didn't ever get to execute the model, but it was a really interesting idea. It was an integrated program, much like our offer speaker talked about earlier, where you could come in looking for a house, you could come in looking for a mortgage, and whichever door you came in, it was an integrated search. But the real interesting twist here was if you came in looking for a mortgage, it would figure out what you could afford to pay in terms of your monthly mortgage payment. U.S. home buyers very seldom think in terms of the actual price of the house. They think in terms of what their monthly mortgage payment is going to be and how much they can afford. So what if this search now started to show you only houses that you could afford based on your mortgage application? So it resorted the properties, and everything you looked at, you knew you'd be able to afford with the mortgage you were approved for. So you're securing your financing, you're visiting the website, which shows you properties you can afford. Again, the website continues to learn, adjusts what it shows you to tastes. Do you only like upgraded kitchens? Do you only like homes with swimming pools? Do you like homes that don't have swimming pools? Let's figure out what to show you and what to hopefully incent you to buy. Agent involvement, pretty much the same as what we talked about last time. So think in terms of what data can enable going forward, less about what data has enabled in the past. I mentioned this earlier, the Big Brother thing, and I'm popping up again the hazard and climate change risks. And just a thought starter for you as we kind of get close to the end here about how data could impact real estate transactions. I don't know if any of you remember years ago, Hurricane Rita and Katrina devastated New Orleans and the Gulf states. There was a period of time after that where it was actually more expensive for somebody to pay for hazard insurance monthly than what they were paying for their mortgage. Insurance companies are starting to look very, very carefully at climate risk, at wildfires, at floods, at hurricanes, at tornadoes. It's getting more and more difficult to insure a home, for example, in California. I had a policy for 22 years, never made a claim, never missed a payment. It was just abruptly canceled because the state had reoriented the risk factor components of different parts of the state. So local governments are going to be looking at zoning laws. Federal and state governments are going to be looking at insurance-like liability, things like the FEMA program. Mortgage lenders may not want to finance a property in a market that's prone to devastation by natural disasters. Insurance companies are going to have insurability issues. Premium prices are going to go up, which has a direct impact on affordability. For those buyers who are already looking at high home prices and high taxes. And builders will definitely look into these areas in terms of construction costs to weather these kind of disasters and whether or not they should even develop in those areas. Really quickly, everybody is using data science today and artificial intelligence to some extent. The iBuyers clearly are using it. They're using it not just from a pricing perspective, although that's a really, really big one. They're also looking at data like days on market and how quickly they can execute a transaction, because holding costs are a big issue if you're an iBuyer. The power buyers, companies like Ribbon, are doing the same thing. They're looking at buyer data, they're looking at mortgage data, they're looking at transaction costs, they're looking at AVMs on properties in order to be able to give you the money you need to make a cash offer on a property while you're still in your house and you haven't sold it yet. So a lot of data being used in these categories. One of the companies that uses our data is a company called TK Interactive. They have a product called Endscope that goes through 300 different data components, much more than we give them. Has an algorithm that predicts with a frightening degree of accuracy which properties are going to be listed for sale in the next 6 to 12 months. That's artificial intelligence beginning to work its way into the real estate agent and investor audience. Companies like TopHap and PropStream are combining all of this data, putting them into slick interfaces for investors who are then able to sort various property types and price ranges in order to figure out which properties they're going to buy and which will meet their ROI goals. And there's a company called Zavvy that also uses our data. This is kind of interesting. Works with agents and their buyers, and their sellers to help them figure out if they're better off selling to an iBuyer, selling to a local investor, or marketing the property in a more traditional MLS listing way. And it shows them the relative costs of doing each of those and what the return might be. So people are already using this. They're just using it in its infancy. We're seeing a lot more proactive work going on in the social media channels and in Google. Now, interestingly enough, we're seeing some privacy issues pop up that might put some roadblocks in the way to more aggressively marketing to people who are doing their searches on Google and in the social media channels. But I know a lot of agents who are very successful pushing out information this way. And the last thing I'd share with you is just a thought. I think CoStar has a really interesting idea here for those of you who have been following along. They already had the largest commercial property website in the world in LoopNet. That led them to invest in Apartments.com because they already had all the apartment buildings in their LoopNet database. Apartments.com has been an unprecedented success for them. They then went out and bought HomeSnap and Homes.com. Now imagine knowing where apartment buildings are going to go up, who the tenants are in those apartment buildings, when those tenants' leases are up for renewal, when those tenants are looking for bigger apartments, and whether those property viewers are people that might be interested now in buying a house, and what agents are available to help them buy and sell a house. It's kind of a closed-loop ecosystem, and it's a really interesting way to be able to use your own proprietary data to move forward with your own business initiatives. And I would submit that everybody who runs a portal has similar data that they can repurpose and use to drive their business forward as well. So I've gone through that as quickly as I could. I hope I didn't bore anybody to death too much. Happy to answer any questions you might have, and thank you again to Simon for inviting me to be here today.
Rick, stay there. I've got the question for you. Okay, how many years away are we from fully automated transaction process for real estate, much like buying a product on Amazon, from your perspective?
From my perspective, well, I think when my grandchildren are through college, I don't have any grandchildren yet, so no, I think realistically it probably is within the next 5 years. It's just a question of taking all of these disparate data points and making them intelligent. But the technology is already there. And companies like Offer that you saw earlier are kind of moving in that direction already. So I think 5 years only because the real estate industry historically, traditionally kind of moves slower than other industries do.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing around data is, and you talked about, 90% of the time is spent on collecting the data.
Yep.
Historically.
Yep. Okay,
and then the problem, how are they solving the problem today where you've got data that's in digital format, but you still got data that's sitting in PDFs, in paper, and so on, which is actually quite relevant data? How are they aggregating that?
The data companies, the us's of the world, actually have invested heavily in being able to take all those disparate data types and converting them into one standard feed. So if you're looking for things like that, you shouldn't have to be worrying about PDFs and pulling things off corkboards in county recorders' offices, and film and tape and other data. I do believe that in the next few years, probably 3 to 5 years, anybody looking to buy data is going to be probably doing it through some sort of cloud-based system where you don't have to worry about anything going on in the back end. All you're worried about is how that data that you're pulling in is going to work specifically with your application. And I think that's going to happen very quickly.
Okay. What is the one data set that you don't have, doesn't exist, that you wish you had, or wish it existed?
I wish we had a way to read the customer's mind. This is a weird thing to say, but in my ideal portal world, the borrower would come in and you'd be able to get his thumbprint or her thumbprint, and that would tell you, what their income level is and where they want to move, and if they're a young family or an older family, or all that stuff, and you could rearrange the site to show them how it worked. During the .com era, I was working with a company that had worked with Land's End and categorized each piece of clothing in the Land's End catalog. And they'd ask you 5 A or B questions, and based on your responses to styles, it would literally reconfigure the entire website and show you clothes that they thought would work for you. And the founder's wife came in and said, "This is stupid, I'd never buy anything from Land's End." And the first thing that popped up was a pair of black leather pants. Now, A, I never knew Land's End had black leather pants, but B, she bought them right there. And it just shows you what's doable. That buyer data set doesn't exist yet. But if we were able to tap into that buyer's search activity, behavior, we'd be able to get probably 80% of it. And that would be a really good head start.
Yeah. How can customers prevent misuse of their data?
And this is why we don't have that buyer data set, because the real concern here is security and privacy. You can't really protect everything. I've had my credit card hacked, 2 different credit cards hacked in the last year myself. So you learn things like always changing your passwords frequently and things like that, not being too predictable. There's a trade-off. I actually don't mind sharing some information if what you're going to feed up to me is more relevant to what I want, what I'm looking for. I think the government, and this is especially true in Europe right now, the states are kind of catching up to it, but everybody's putting in much more stringent privacy laws. So as a consumer, your job really is to take advantage of the privacy laws that are there. A lot of people don't bother to read that little disclaimer that pops up when you go to a website that says, there's an option, don't sell my data. Do that if you want to protect your data. So take advantage of the privacy tools and the protections that are out there.
Okay. Interesting thing, I do some work with a UK-based data company called Harness.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've heard them, but they're very, very good operators, and they've got very good information around commercial data sets in the UK market and some residential. And they've done some very interesting analysis across and getting linkages, and they're very good at converting PDFs into data, into fielded data. They worked with the UK government to identify 25,000 properties in England owned by Russian oligarchs.
Interesting.
Right?
Yeah.
That they because they cross-reference it to the Panama Papers, right? So there's all this cross-referencing now occurring to discover what it is that you may or may not own, or in this case they owned, through multiple companies. That's then given the government access to information. And what that is, it was all started with the property data that they had collected.
Yeah, and we get a question about investors a lot. There's a meme running around in the press today that in the U.S., Main Street is buying up Wall Street is buying up Main Street. Huge institutional investors are buying all the properties. Collectively, the really big investors own less than 2% of single-family residential units across the country. Mom and pop investors own 95%. But you don't know that until you dig into the data.
Yes.
And the data is sometimes hard to get into. There was a finance question here that I just saw somewhere. What we believe has happened is, since coming out of the foreclosure crisis, the financial crisis, buyers have been conditioned to get their financing in place, and especially in this hot market, which is cooling off, but they've been conditioned to get their financing in place before they start shopping for a house. And I think that's going to continue to happen. It does make for a more informed buyer, but more than that, I think it streamlines the whole process for everybody. You're not spinning your wheels showing houses to people they can't possibly ever afford. So I think there is a value for the consumer there and for the industry as well.
Very interesting stuff. Rick, thank you once again for a fantastic presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.